Hello, it's me again. I wasn't expecting to be here, but there's another chap who fell ill. So, but I'm not doing all the talking this time. We've got a fabulous panel to do that. Now, in this session, we've got about an hour in which we're going to talk about the biggest story of our time, really, which is the role that story has in the media, the world that is created through the constant repetition of versions of events told to us by the great and the good, and increasingly by more insurgent medias as well. And of course, so many of the things that we live with day to day that are come under the veil of factual reporting in the media are in effect stories. When you hear about austerity, that's a story. When you hear tales of what's happening in the world in terms of migration and immigration, that's a story. When almost every morning you turn on the headlines and you hear something about the markets, you're being told a story under the veil of events passed off as just how things are. So to interrogate that, we've got, like I said, a great panel. And it's important, too, to remember that in order for stories to be effective, and who tells the best stories controls the narrative, stories don't have to be long. And I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of very short stories that are nevertheless quite powerful. One of the shortest stories, again, one of the shortest and one of the saddest stories ever told goes like this. For sale. Baby shoes, never worn. Margaret Atwood is known for churning out stories at length, but she can tell a short story too, one of which was longed for him, got him, shit. One of my other favourite stories is by Eileen Gunn, who wrote a science fiction story in this genre, which went, computer, did we bring batteries? Computer. So, to see a very diverse take on the role of story in the media, we are going to hear a little bit each from our panel. They're going to talk a little bit each, and then I might ask them one or two questions, and then we're going to throw it open to you. And in order, we are going to be hearing from Catherine Templer-Lewis, who is a creative scientist. Actually, I was not in order. I've broken the list already. We're going to be hearing, first of all, from Alex Beiner, who's the co-founder of Rebel Wisdom, and he's going to tell you a little bit about Rebel Wisdom. And then we're going to be hearing from Catherine Templer-Lewis, a creative scientist. And then rounding off, we're going to be hearing from Indra Adnan, who's a psychotherapist and one of the driving forces of an initiative called the Alternativet UK. So I'm just going to kind of hand over the mic to them to speak for a bit each, and then we'll see how we unfold the story of the media and story itself. So over to you, Alex.
Hi, everybody. This is an unusual seating arrangement, so if I don't look on your side very often, please, it's not personal. I just have to back and forth a lot. So, yeah, I'm co-founder of Rebel Wisdom. We're a media platform, and we interview rebellious thinkers in lots of different fields, from philosophy through to psychology and biology and lots of different areas, to find some direction through the very fragmented and chaotic cultural landscape we find ourselves in. And I suppose what we've been particularly interested in is something that a lot of people have called the meaning crisis. So a lot of people see that as the meta crisis that underlies lots of different expressions. For example, a crisis in mental health, crisis in trust that we have in our institutions, and as we heard earlier, in one another. We think 70% of everyone else is just simply untrustworthy. And arguably trust in the very fabric of why are we here and what we're doing as a species. And that hole in the culture is one that I'm very interested in, because usually the hole has been filled by many different things, and it's been filled primarily by religion. And I'm a big believer in the importance of that, in the religious impulse being met somehow. Nietzsche famously talked about the death of God, and that there's a God-shaped hole in our society. And a lot of people we've interviewed have argued that that has been filled by ideology. So there's a kind of religious intensity around ideology. And a lot of people have written about this. John Gray has written about this, and many people we've interviewed have talked about it. And I think it's really true that in the absence of having a really core foundation in meaning and what we're doing and why we're doing it, we turn to other places. And they become ever more extreme on the right and the left, I would say. So what's happened from what we've observed is that the internet in particular has broken into what a friend of mine, Peter Limburg, has called mimetic tribes. So it's not a polar world where it was very simple, sort of talking about stories. Stranger Things, I think, is really interesting to look at, why that was such a popular show. Aside from the writing being really great, it's a real heavy dose of nostalgia for a time that was much simpler and a time that many of the viewers lived through. And that was a time where it was East and West, and it was communism and capitalism. And if you look at like a Rocky movie, it was so simple and so easy to know who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. And in many ways, we're living, in my opinion, in much more of a different storyline now, which is like a noir storyline. So in the genre of noir, the detective is going through this world that is corrupt to its core in every single way. The priest is corrupt, the judge is corrupt, no one can be trusted. I think that's certainly my experience of the world we live in a lot of ways. So what does that mean for the way we tell stories? I think part of what I've noticed is that we are mistrustful of stories as well as fixated on them, kind of strange relationship with them. Postmodernism is a big intellectual, maybe psycho-spiritual impulse in our society. So this idea that the world is made up of many smaller narratives and there's no grand narrative. And more than that, narrative itself is forever at war with other narratives. And so the mimetic tribes I just mentioned, they're at war for control of the narrative, whatever narrative it is. And there are many, many different types. You might be an anti-vaxxer, or you might be in Extinction Rebellion, or you might be in any number of other groups. And it's not that there's anything necessarily wrong with any mimetic tribe, it's just that there are so many of them, and we're in a kind of constant state of war. Which, I mean, you can just see it. Just spend enough time on Facebook or Twitter and wedge yourself into an argument, and you get to be a sort of casualty or a fighter in a really pointless ongoing war over narrative supremacy that has no beginning or end. So in my view, that's sort of where we're at the moment. And I'm particularly interested in what would it look like to have a new grand narrative while not falling into the same issues that were rightly pointed out by postmodernism. You know, the grand narratives of the past were also very constrictive, and they were also didn't really recognize people on the margins of them. You were kind of forced into them. And so that's not something I would really want, but I'm also really interested in, I find the fragmentation is not very good for our sense-making and for our quest to have meaningful lives. It's very exhausting, and it doesn't give us this deep mythic connection to ourselves that we so desperately need, I think. So that's kind of an ongoing inquiry for me at the moment, is what does a new narrative look like that sort of binds us in some way? And I have a few ideas about what that might be, but I'm not, they're kind of forming, so I won't share them now. But hopefully that gives a bit of a kind of wide spectrum of, at least in the media landscape, what's going on. I suppose just to link it back to media, lots of media institutions have fallen into becoming a member of one mimetic tribe or another. And it's very rare now that you find a media institution that isn't catering to one or more mimetic tribes. And so that means the way that we're hearing stories, in the media in particular, is very difficult to trust. Whose story is this, what I'm hearing? If I'm watching CNN, if I'm watching another news, whose story is this? It's, you know, the idea of journalistic objectivity is also sort of falling by the wayside. And maybe it was never there to begin with, who knows? But, so that's the landscape, I think, that part of the landscape we might be finding ourselves in. So leave it there.
Thank you, Alex. I just think mimetic tribes would make a really good band name if it doesn't exist already. I'm absolutely fascinated hearing your comments about the 1980s as well, because I kind of lived through the 1980s, and I just really don't remember them as being a simple thing at all. I mean, I tried to read Derrida in the 1980s. I can tell you it really, really wasn't simple. And I remember being sort of slightly bewildered, looking around at the British left, thinking, why can't it get its shit together? That wasn't simple either. But nevertheless, I'm also almost filled with an overpowering desire to say, tell us a story, having heard all that. But maybe you'll tell us a story. If we ask really, really nicely, maybe you'll tell us a story at the end of the session. We'll see how it goes. Okay, now, over to Catherine.
Thank you. Yes, hello. It's nice and cozy. I'm finally warming up, which is good. What I wanted to talk about, so my background, I'm labeled a technologist and a futurist, and I'm not at all. I'm a humanist. I've studied humans from genetics to neuroscience. It just so happens that one of the greatest tools that we've created is technology. And my sort of view at the moment, I was asked next week for International Women's Day to run a workshop at the Tate on XR, VR, AR, and storytelling. Which is interesting because I think it's something we often forget when we think about storytelling. We think about sort of, ancient myth telling, things like that. We developed language, it was a tool. One of the most recent tools that we've developed is things like VR and technology. So for me, it's very natural that we have these new forms of storytelling. And I think they're getting a bit of a bad reputation. As you mentioned, this dystopic narrative, we're seeing things like, Black Mirrors swamping our televisions, all these dystopic narratives. And I think we do have to be careful. There aren't enough pro-topic narratives out there. And I think we need to be writing them because we have, with new technology, this incredible ability to build collective narratives. And for the first time ever, we're not just telling stories around fires for small communities. We're having to find big, global, connected narratives. So, of course, technology in this is an incredible enabler. For example, first of all, everyone can be a storyteller. We are all storytellers, but with your phone in your pocket, you're now an artist. You can take a picture, you can put it on Instagram. That's a form of story. Everybody can access it. We have things like VR, which are immersive storytellings, where there's a VR story right now which is creating a world where the laws of physics are changed. So things can be completely different. We have AI writing stories and coming up with narratives that are very non-human. They're sort of pushing our creativity. So I think in terms of, the point of being a story to show someone a different perspective, we've got amazing tools to do it. Now within this, we've got sort of inherent problem in that we're forgetting to be critical about it. So the internet is this amazing tool to tell people stories on. It's dangerous because you tell that story and it's written down forever, or that picture can be interpreted in 1,000 different ways. And the World Economic Forum has actually announced that one of the key skills that we need to teach young people is to look at the internet and be critically aware of what is true and what is not, to make decisions for ourselves. What is fake news? What is not? Everyone's blaming the internet for these sort of fake stories, but we've always had this ability to deceive. It's just that if somebody's telling you a story, you're much more aware, you're much more evolved to know whether you think it's true, whether it's an embellishment of the truth. We're not so good on these digital platforms. So on the one hand, we have this amazing opportunity to tell stories. Everybody can, but we've got to be careful as well. Within this, you see this idea of, well, are there myths? And I've heard it quite a few times. Well, we don't have myths. Well, of course we still have myths. But one of the other things that this ability for us all to be storytellers has done is reduce this idea of the sacred, the idea of myths being sacred. Because before, when you had storytellers, whether they were dancers or artists or just spoken word storytellers, there were very few of them. You had to go to see them. So there was this sort of sacredness around them. And that's being reduced with modern media and technology. Our myths, our stories, yes, they're still manuals for morality, but they're really reduced in the sacredness. And of course, they are set in stone. We can't change them. You're not always there to defend a story or to tell it in the first person. But there is this huge opportunity that I'm really excited about. And one of the one things I wanted, a good example of this is something, has anyone here called the Climate Narrative Project? Go check it out. It's the perfect example of this. It's by a journalist called Biggers, who, like me, sort of talks a lot about the need for pro-topic, collective, future-building narratives. This idea, I don't know if anyone here believes in, is Warfarism, which is sort of language creates reality. so the stories we tell can actually create the future. So the Climate Narrative Project, with this journalist, he's a historian as well, and he looked at what we were discussing, especially in the media. And while we're talking about climate change, we're not amongst us talking about climate change. We're not talking about solutions. We're not talking about sort of regenerative solutions. It's just this condemnation and dystopic narratives. And he realized there's this huge need for storytellers around climate change, not just about what's happening, but about solutions, because these are the stories that will galvanize people, that will help people sort of engage in action. He envisioned sort of climate storytellers as he labeled them as community organizers. And what's amazing is that they can, he's working at the moment in universities and with children in the hope that they will go on and tell these stories, but not just in person, on digital platforms, in the media as well. Because I think there is this culture shift that we need. We know there's this need for a collective future-building sort of narrative, but stories do change culture. And I think the role of media is incredibly powerful, but it's being a bit demonized. And so I think there's a lot of issues around, yes, questionability and responsibility as well. But everyone in this room can use media, can use digital technology to actually be a storyteller. And I think that's really important. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And if there's any other kind of students of literature in the room, it is quite strange, isn't it, how the unreliable narrator is a well-established feature of storytelling since time immemorial, but you turn on the World Wide Web and you switch on YouTube and you go, wow, that's amazing, that can't be real. Is that real? Wow, that's amazing. Anyway. And as I'm in the chair, I can kind of abuse my position and just say again, those positive stories of change, referring precisely to your point, if you have a little look on rapidtransition.org, it's an alliance of 50+ organizations, and they are stories of change where things are happening and working well with a particular climate focus. But now, of someone who is trying to build a narrative, a story of change about new possibilities here in the UK, is Indra Adnan, who's a psychotherapist and the driving force with the Alternatives UK.
Thank you. Great to hear from both of you, because you've really set up a sort of a landscape which I would agree with, which is that we're living in a time of multiple stories and tools for telling stories, and the sense that we can be storytellers. So, there is an incredible moment of opportunity, but perhaps I would add a note of caution. Because it's not simply the story that is leading us, and also the idea that there might be one good story that's somehow going to lead us all out of the mess we're in is also questionable. So I just want to take it back to my own story of growing up, really. So I had a lot of struggles as a child, but at a certain point in my life, I did understand profoundly that what was really disempowering me was the story I was telling myself about myself. And these internal stories are probably the most powerful operating tools in our lives. And in fact, I'd invite you just for a second now, I'm going to stop for a second, and try to identify what story you're telling yourself about yourself right now. What's going on for you right now? What's the story? I don't know how many of you came to something quickly, but then I'm going to stop again, in fact, and I'm going to ask you, what's the story you're telling about me right now? As I'm sitting here asking you about your story. My guess is that you'd have some things in common, but you've probably all got quite different stories to tell about yourselves. Some of you will have gone right back to your childhood. Some of you will have just talked about why it was cold in here, but there's a story going on. And then there's another story going on about what's going on up here. And these are really the most important stories, because they are the ones that are making you take a particular action. There was a series of stories that you're telling yourself that made you come here today, and then another one that's either getting you to listen to what we're saying or be completely close to what we're saying. I was talking to somebody today about why, whether or not a panel ever makes any difference to a person's life, Because if you've got a whole set of stories already going in your head, it's quite difficult to penetrate those things, right? So this is the meta story about the story, which is it plays a certain kind of role in our lives, but it's not everything. What else is going on is that constantly we're trying to get our emotional needs met, right? So physiologically, as human beings, we're born to get our emotional needs met. All right, so that's the biggest story, actually, is that we need to get these things met. Now, if you want to know what I mean by emotional needs, I'm not talking about, happiness, sadness, grief, anger. I'm talking about the need for status, the need for belonging and meaning and purpose, for achievement, for privacy. These are the things that are driving us all the time, physiologically as human beings. And why is that important? Because that's what storytelling is built around, in fact. Successful storytelling taps into our needs, right? So why are we consumers, for example? Because advertising knows how to tell stories that taps into our emotional needs to get us to do stuff. So their storytelling is quite targeted, it's very informed, and in fact, it's the reason we've become consumers. We're consumers because they're telling us stories that get our emotional needs met that make us buy this product. So my need for belonging is the reason I bought that handbag. My need for status is the reason I bought that handbag. My need for belonging was the reason I drink Coca-Cola. My need for meaning and purpose is why I buy stuff from John Lewis. So we're being played all the time through our emotional needs and the skilled storytelling of other people. So I just wanted to put that in as an additional factor, because stories don't land because they're good stories. There isn't a good, as Andrew just said, he's got a website full of stories, good stories. Why do we choose one and not another? Why did we buy into the growth economy? Because we were told the stories that basically was able to harness our emotions. So there's a relationship between storytelling and getting our emotional needs met. And if we want to tell another story, a really good story, we've got to be able to do that. So I know I'm finished my 5 minutes, but just to say why we started the Alternative UK, because we recognize, which is a political platform, so it answers the question, if politics is broken, what's the alternative? And the very first thing we realized is that the story that the old politics is telling us is that the human being is just Homo economicus, it only needs material things, whereas we know that human beings are biopsychosocial spiritual entities that need many things. And the second thing is that we are powerless. That is the most important story that the old politics is telling us, that we, the people, are powerless, and we need the people at the top to really show us and tell us what to do. So the alternative will tell another story. That's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Indra. And I think what I'm going to do, just to kind of kick off with, just to kind of pick up from where all three of our speakers have been sort of moving in a certain direction. I'm going to start off with almost kind of in reverse order. So I'm going to go straight back to Indra and ask you. I'm going to ask you one thing and ask a question of all three of you at the same time, because we've talked about this at a very good theoretical level, but of course stories are also very particular, and that's the way in which they sort of meet our needs. So I've got a double question to Indra, because she's going to get the same question as all the others as well. But the particular question, I suppose, is that coming precisely off your analysis of a good story is one which meets an emotional need. I'm really interested about the success of the story of austerity over the last few years and why it proved so politically powerful. And while you're answering that, I'm going to invite our other speakers to think about an example of a story which you think has been successful, which is delivering a counter-narrative to the mainstream political and economic story of the moment, which is perhaps one which might be a bit more hopeful, and why you think it's been successful. And to give you a chance to think about that, I'm going to go to Indra first.
So the story of austerity, why do we buy into it? I imagine it's because it was a shared project. So we had we were invited into the project of saving Britain through, running our household well. So it offered us a kind of security, which is one of our basic needs, and a sense of belonging that we were going to do this together. And, we know it's a very fake story because the money was always there to do other things and it was being spent elsewhere. But there was a sort of heroism in being, in allowing this story that we were all in this together and that we were going to pull together, take responsibility, and save ourselves from some sort of objective idea that there is no money. So I think that's what was really being, plied, and that it shamed us. We were shamed if we stepped outside of that story of austerity. So I think it was the joint project. Yeah, does that make sense?
I think that makes perfect sense, and I suppose a short follow-up question would be, what does it take to crack the veneer of a story like that, which, when subject to sort of factual and practical analysis, doesn't hold up? When you see Jacob Rees-Mogg reclining derisively on the green leather sofas of Parliament, what keeps it standing for so long after the event?
I mean, I would question whether or not bad stories can be countered by good stories, because if you start to just deny the story, you are actually in the story. The difficult thing is to build a different one completely. It's not difficult. It's more seductive actually to start something completely new, and invite people into that project. So our story about economies or to do with self-reliance, to do with how we're going to thrive, that becomes the question. And we talk more about how people can experience their freedom and their autonomy and expression, and we offer community to people as ways into new stories. So they're attracted into, we are building citizens' action networks, for example, around the country. I say that very confidently, but they're small, but they're already there in a sense. Look at what people are already doing. That's, for us, the source of new storytelling. They're already reaching out to each other, building small communities. They're going for local solutions rather than national ones. They're pulling away from the national story and trying to find meaning and purpose where they are. So, and we big that up. So rather than reach for a story and try to offer something seductive again, or a counter-narrative, we watch what people are doing and give attention to it to help it to grow. And that's their storytelling. So they become the storytellers. Yeah.
Thank you, that's fascinating. So there's a kind of an emergent property to that as well. So let's move along the sofa. Catherine, a good story that stands on its own 2 feet.
In the face of sort of this issue of austerity, one that counters
in any sense.
In any sense. I think, well, in terms of answering so directly about austerity, I think what's interesting is if you look at the psychology of stories we're willing to accept when it comes to division of wealth, what psychology is showing us is that people don't mind if it's uneven if they think it's fair. And so I think there has in the past been this idea that, well, there's a fairness to what's happening, and that's changed as well. And I think, if we're talking about the role of the media, one amazing thing it's done is, like you say, connect people on a grassroots level so they can actually discuss things and not accept things. And I think what's interesting as well is all these sort of linear narratives that have been handed down are completely broken now, and we see that. And there's an interesting project called the Generation Poetry, if anyone's ever heard of it. And it's looking at the way we're telling stories now, and without sort of going, oh, it's all millennials on Instagram and WhatsApp. what actually seems to be happening is that people are talking in more fragmented, the stories they're telling are more fragmented. And actually we've laughed at people communicating through, GIFs and memes and things like this. But actually, this whole organization is studying this language that we're talking in because of digital platforms. And it's not linear anymore. It's more like poetry. And in poetry, everybody brings something to that short meaning, and meaning comes together. You bring more to a poem as a person than you do when you just get handed down a narrative. So what I'm quite interested in is actually this non-linear storytelling and the use of media platforms that were sort of derided because everyone's like, oh, it's just a GIF. But actually for being quite powerful, non-linear fragment. I know you were against fragmented stories earlier, and I was like, no, I think they can be incredibly powerful because it's if to me sort of stories are just, human experiences overlapping stories of different people. And there's a lovely place, I think, for these sort of short snippets on digital media to portray meaning in a way that's often overlooked because we associate it with short attention spans or not proper stories in sort of this linear sense. But I think we need to move beyond linear narratives now.
Wonderful. Maybe we're going the full cycle of history because I believe some of the earliest things committed to earliest forms of writing which survive to this day are some Mesopotamian fragments of clay. And on one of these early Mesopotamian fragments, the most significant one which still exists, the story is about how everything's falling apart and society is crumbling. So, plus ça change. Now, Alex, you told us you weren't going to tell us a story. I'm now going to completely override your wishes and come back to you and say, tell us a story. What do you think's good?
What do I think is good? I don't know if I can tell a story. I mean, what comes up for me, just to clarify as well, because I think it's a good point, I think fragmented, many overlapping stories is great. And I think, but even the early post-structuralist thinkers who were looking at this phenomena pointed out that without a sublime to ground it in, without some point at which all the narratives stop and there's something to hold them, it leads to a kind of madness. So I think they're great, but it's like a yes and. But stories, I mean, I was thinking, I've been sitting here bricking myself because I thought I had to answer the other questions, so I've got all these notes. But
you get to do that
so
too.
I'm going to do that too, yeah. But actually, I think it's a really interesting question, what stories stand on their own 2 feet? And I think the stories that stand on their own 2 feet are the ones that talk about the one thing that we don't like to talk about, which is death. It's a real party pooper, that one. But it's true. I think the stories that really touch us are the ones that deal with and explore death. So Christianity is probably one of the most powerful that gave a kind of redemptive hope. The Matrix does it as well. Neo dies and is reborn. So it's kind of comes up over and over again. And I think it's very interesting that we now talk very often about existential crisis, existential risk from Mesopotamia onwards to now. It's either we're confronting in some way death or we're confronting suffering. And I think the stories that really touch us are the ones that really explore and help us come to terms with and deal with that in some way. So, yeah, I mean, the Matrix comes up again. But there's so many different expressions of that in our culture. And so when I think about a story that really stands the test of time, I think it has to have some element of helping us understand our own suffering. It's similar to what Indra was talking about, so those emotional needs and the ultimate emotional needs, those very core levels, I think, they start to get into that territory as well. So, yeah, I don't really have a story, but yeah.
Indra.
You know how you want to say, you wish you had said something else, but when you ask the question, what is the most successful, or what has been a successful story, the one that I'm most fascinated with was, take back control. And why take back control? I think, if we look back in history, in the future, and we look back at this moment, and we, because right now we think of that as something that's quite pernicious. It was offered to people not in a real way. It was just literally triggering an emotion, which is the need for control. It's absolutely fundamental emotional need It could also be described as the need for autonomy. This is central to us. It's not something that we talk about in progressive politics, but it's something, interestingly, that the right talks about a lot. If you want to make a division, I don't really like the divisions, I just made one. Apologies for that. But it's so fundamental, and it was used to get a result. We should really acknowledge how powerful that was. But now it's also triggered something else. You know, it's like a rash of people's autonomy now. You know, people wanting to take back control of all sorts of things. And I can only think of that as a good thing, to be honest, because the lack of control that each individual, that human beings have had over their own futures until now, has allowed us to be swept into something which, let's face it, we're facing the, human extinction. How did we get into that place? Well, it must be because we didn't have control over our own lives in some way. And this awakening of the need for us to take responsibility and to take control over our own lives, I would say ultimately has been a good one.
So everything from the school strike for climate to the Citizens' Assembly movement and Extinction Rebellion itself, all expressions of another emergent property of the successful appeal for more agency and taking back control.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn to the audience for a moment, because as we know, the collective intelligence of the room is, however brilliant the sofa art, is always more than we've got on the sofa. I'm also kind of really curious about so much of the stories which form a common cultural inheritance. Kind of give us some of the right ideas at the moment. Just as you were speaking, and I was trying to think if somebody put the question to me about successful stories, and I wrote down Midas, Canute, and Icarus. You know, in the story of Midas, the futility of wealth accumulation. In the story of Canute, the futility of trying to resist and dominate the forces of nature. And in Icarus, a moral tale about the dangers of overreach. I thought that we're surrounded by tales and stories which could inform other pathways, but I wonder if, keeping it relatively brief, given the democracy of airspace, I wonder if there's anybody who would like to call out a story of their own which they find particularly useful and interesting, as offering up other organizing principles for how we might live at the moment. Oh, there's a hand, and just over there.
Thank you, hi. That was a really interesting panel, thank you so much.
We're not over yet. Just saying.
Okay. You sort of prompted me in a way because of, you mentioned Icarus, and I'm just working with a coach at the moment, and he was sharing about the way that I live my life. And he helped me with a story which I didn't know the other half to the Icarus story. So I thought when you mentioned about overreach of the Icarus story, the second half to the story is that you can be threatened by going too far up to the sun, but you can also be threatened by, so he was either going up to the sun and burning his wings or falling down and drowning. And one of the most challenging stories that I'm learning about myself is to enjoy that sense of being average and being in a space where you're comfortable in parameters and you know where you're safe, you know where there is a peace and a calm and a happiness, and it doesn't need to be too high and it doesn't need to be too low, and it's a very beautiful place to exist in. So I thought I'd share that.
So find the right cruising height.
Yeah.
Something we can all work on. That's really nice. Thank you so much. Any more? Would like to? Any other little shares? Have we got a share over here?
Thank you. So I'm an artist and performer, and I've been working with I guess it's a story, it's also a myth, the myth of Artemis from Greek mythology for a number of years. And I find the more that I work with her and with that story, the more I realize how relevant it is to our times. What I know her as is a guardian, and somebody that is in direct relationship with nature, who lives in nature. She kind of lives in the groves of the forest, and yeah, she's fiercely, she's a huntress. She's fiercely passionate about guardianship and about the things that she's in guardianship to. And I feel like that's such a relevant story to our times about how we step into that guardianship with like this fierce passion in a way that isn't swayed by external things, but that we can hold fast to that commitment to what we value to be guardians of. So I found that myth and story very relevant to my life in these times.
That's lovely, the idea of fierce guardianship. Really good. You're going to respond?
Oh, no, I was going to say, because everyone's talking about sort of Greek mythologies, and the one that no one's mentioned is, oh God, his name escapes me, he's the son of Helios. Is it Phaethon, who he was born of Helios and a nymph, and he wasn't as divine but he was the sort of son of a god, and it was just the warning tale that we all didn't listen to, and he decided that he wanted to prove that he could be like a god, so he stole the sun chariot from Helios, his father, and he was warned, don't use the whip, don't go crazy, but he went crazy like all humans do, and what happened was it came so close to the earth that the earth got hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and plants started to die and animals started to die, and the human race was about to go extinct, until Zeus, his brother, shot a lightning bolt and killed him and stopped it all. So I love that story because we think, yes, this is a story that's pathetic and it's warning us, but it doesn't help us get out of this situation. And so there's all these stories that explain how we got into this situation, but what I can't get to is how, that bit about Zeus and the lightning bolt, what is the modern day bit of that? Like where are the stories to help us get out of them yet?
There's a challenge. Maybe some of them are in the audience, and there's a hand going straight up. Let's find out. Now, pay attention, everybody. You're going to hear the answer now.
So I'm going to tell you a story it's only me that knows this story, and it's the story of a friend of mine from South Africa who, when I met her about 25 years ago, we were talking about washing machines, and she said, oh, I like my washing machine. It stands on 2 black legs. And I didn't even realize that she was talking about a human being, and I was so shocked. But the end of the story is I met her about many years later, and she said, Nelson Mandela is the greatest statesman that's ever lived. So the story is that profound change happens to an individual. End of story.
The possibility of change, the possibility of transitions, and that's what we're living through at the moment. And we have another hand over, another couple of hands. One hand there, and lady here, and gentleman over there.
It's come up recently due to the fantastic BBC series of His Dark Materials that reminded me of my love of that story, of Lyra against all odds being the one that knows where to go, because she hasn't logically worked it out. There's something, a force sort of greater than herself that she's following through her adventures. And when the first time I read it, I don't think I quite clocked the strength and power of the alethiometer, the small dialed instrument she takes around with her. For me, this when I watched it again, the power of that alethiometer really struck me as Lyra is a child, and she's the only one who can, all the adults are in awe of her being able to, against all odds, find a path through and know where to go. The way that she reads it is beyond her logical understanding, but the power of her imagination and her ability to sink into essentially the present and to understand the energy that's going on around her on a really, really deep level is the way that she is then guided through the symbols and the sort of tangible form of the alethiometer to find the way through. And for me, that particular instrument is so powerful, and I think Philip Pullman doesn't explicitly talk about this as being the instinct that we have as a child and that we need to tap back into as adults. But yeah, it's something that's stuck with me since.
That's a lovely example, and it's also a good example looking at Philip Pullman himself as a sort of become one of the great storytellers of the moment, about ways in which you can sometimes tell stories without even realizing what you're saying. This is going to sound like a terrible name drop. Trust me, it's not. It's just relevant to this particular point. But I was interviewing Philip Pullman for a chapter for a book a few years ago, and we were talking about his writing of the trilogy, and we were talking about climate change. And I suggested to him, because I thought with the idea of the subtle knife and the demons which are unleashed by the cutting between worlds, I said, is there an analogy in that for climate change? And he said he hadn't kind of been aware of it at the time, but since then there was a period when he was writing it, when he sat in his back garden in Oxford and he was staring at the sky and looking at the traces from the aeroplanes that were flying overhead and thinking about climate change. And so he was, in effect, telling a story about climate change without even realizing he was at the time. Anyway, gentleman over here with a hand.
Thank you very much. I think one of the stories that's intriguing me at the moment is the story of levelling up. Boris Johnson's put it forward as his sort of way of talking about what he plans to do with the country. And while he's not my favourite individual, I think the story is quite intriguing, and it seems a very modern way of talking about a sense of progress, a sense of integrating what's gone before, perhaps sort of reviewing and reflecting on what we want to keep and what we want to discard, but a real sense of moving to a more sophisticated, higher plane. You see similar sorts of ideas and language in personal growth. You see similar sorts of ideas and language in therapy. The idea of integrating what's gone before and kind of moving on to a more sophisticated, complex space. Maybe I'm hoping for too much from a politician, but I'm intrigued by the potential direction of the story of levelling up.
So just for a little bit of clarification, because there's a number of different ways one can understand their sort of call to level up. It could just be one which is simply about levels of consumption, levels of wealth, levels of consumerism, etc. But do you think in the way that it's being articulated politically at the moment, it kind of goes beyond just getting the North to be as rich as the South, for example?
I mean, my understanding of levelling up comes from video games, which is really where I think it's founded. And in a sense, when your character levels up as a video game, they master some skill, they master some potential, and they normally become not just stronger and bigger, but more complex and more competent at the same time. And I hope that that's where the story will lead, in the sense that we're not just going to sort of bring others up to the status quo, but we've got a potential perhaps to build a more complex, integrated society. Like I say, I don't know what his true intentions are. I'm reading more into the story perhaps than is there, but as a frame, I think there's a lot of potential in it, and it intrigues me.
Thank you. And the idea of a more complex and competent Boris Johnson is itself quite an interesting one.
Can I just...
Right, let's take another couple, and then I'm going to come back to... I'm going to take a couple more, and then I'm going to come back to the panel and give them a chance to reflect on all the wonderful things that you've said. So let's go back over this side. I've seen there's two on the front row. Two on the front row. They were the first I saw.
Hi, I work in helping people reconnect to nature through art and music, and through my personal study of music, I've come to kind of use the analogy of life being like a symphony, and it came through my study of also the Toltecs from Mexico, who saw themselves as artists and life as their work of art. So I really enjoy working with artists and creatives because they allow the full spectrum of emotions and experience to be there in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. And it's amazing to see the contemporary music is just embracing everything, and it's getting so weird and so eclectic. It's amazing. And so it helps me whenever, a symphony has highs and lows, and it's not about getting to the end of it, it's about being in the music. So that to me has been the most useful thing at the moment. So it goes beyond language into that feeling world. We don't get stuck in concepts and stories. We can hold them, but hold them lightly as we dance along. I mean, to me, we're getting better at music. I think it's amazing. We just have a big party around it all. But yeah, that one. And then number two, because my dad was an explorer of ancient cultures in South America, I grew up around someone that went from being a civil engineer to an explorer, researcher, and managed to set up national incentives to preserve areas of jungles. And that idea of being an explorer now, because we're faced with so much unknown. Explorers are doing that constantly. They're mapping new landscapes for everyone, so it comes with a certain level of fear that you have to face. You have to go into the unknown to find these new lands. So how do we stay open constantly as we're trying to compute a huge amount of information and then dropping back into the artistic space? Because I also say to people, I'm not sure I want to stay here if we don't make it fun anyway. I was like, you know, we might want to save the planet, but if it's not, we're not going to be decent to one another. Like, it's going to be, you know, just, yeah, can we make it a bit lighter and more, you know, fun?
Thank you. So, as the famous quote goes, who wants to be part of a revolution if there's no dancing? And we're all explorers on a path made by walking. I think one more over here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
So I've got two quick ones as well. The first is from Greek myth. I remember when I was a kid hearing about Dionysus and Apollo and being like, who on earth would follow Apollo when there's Dionysus? But I think that's the trouble with our world. You know, we need a little bit more of the kind of modest mean. And I think people don't want all that shit in their houses. They don't want to live giddy lives. We now feel a sort of hunger for a kind of balance. So that's one. Another that inspires me, because I am a Buddhist, is the Shambhala warriors, that when the world is in trouble, the Shambhala warriors will arise, and their weapons will be insight and compassion. And I think we could do with a bit of that.
We could certainly do with a bit of that. I don't remember Dionysus being particularly modest, but anyway. Right, now we're going to go back to the panel. Yeah, I'm joking. Let's start with Catherine. You look ready to speak.
Oh, no, I was just looking ever ready, yes.
Holding a microphone with intent.
I was thinking Dionysus is fun, yes. What? Yes, wine? I was That's what that face was. And it's probably only midday still. So the response to that really is interesting, because everybody always goes back to the Greek mythologies. I do as well. And I'm very interested, like, can we create modern ones? You know, and there's, anyone knows Roland Barthes' mythologies. It's a guy who wrote about the semiotics of mythology in the 50s, and looking at sort of modern iconography, and that's been updated again, stating things like the Kardashians might be these new sort of figures of mythology. And again, I'm sort of interested. I think we need to try and find sort of modern icons in a way that we can weave into mythologies. And the other thing I think that we need to do very desperately, which you picked up on, is one thing we don't tell our children is cosmology and sort of this, like, the creation myths. And one big problem we know we're having is the way we're destroying nature. And one group of people who don't do that is obviously indigenous people. And they grow up not only more entrenched in nature and seeing themselves as part of nature, but also they tell so many stories about their relationship with nature. And, you know, this idea of nature-relatedness, which a lot of people in this room study, in fact. And, you know, nature-relatedness is actually one of the few indicators of pro-environmental behavior. You know, if someone can feel related to nature, they're much more likely to go and, you know, even recycle. So I think one solution, one thing we need to be doing a lot, you know, not everyone can get into nature, is start telling more stories about us back in nature. You know, we see ourselves now as very modern city dwellers, but we need to actually bring back those stories that connect us to nature, so that we grow up more at one with nature.
That's fantastic, Catherine. And for anybody who hasn't come across it yet, one initiative which is live at the moment telling exactly that story is the National Park City initiative. And London became the first national park city last year and is recruiting volunteer wardens to help introduce people and to see London through a green lens in that way. And it's very much an international movement. I'd encourage everybody to get involved with that. It's a really, really nice thing. And over to Alex.
Yeah, thank you everyone for all the stories and contributions. I was really struck. I felt like there was a kind of thread almost forming with a lot of what everyone was saying, which I wanted to try and piece together a bit, where you had that wonderful, you talked about Lyra in the Northern Lights, and this sense of her using compass or the heliometer. It's a very hard word to say. But needing to kind of come into this liminal space where she was kind of intuitive. And then I started thinking about Luke Skywalker, because that's the kind of the peak of Star Wars. It's don't use the machine, use the Force. You trust your instinct, and that's a theme I think that runs through, or going to unknown lands, or even that South African woman's transformation in a way. There's some sense of we are kind of embedded in the world and we change through it. And I think that in storytelling, and maybe where we are as a species as well, that we've tried very hard to maintain a very tight grip on control. And the more tightly we try to maintain control, paradoxically, the further and further we get away from being able to control things. And when we let go of control, we come into a new kind of, maybe not control, but a new kind of flow with the world and a new way of being in the world. And so we get this kind of agency, kind of a new type of agency, which is higher than the egoic agency. And I think it's reflected in stories everywhere. And I think it's fascinating that comes out as a kind of over and over again as a kind of our stories tell us to take ourselves a bit less seriously and to let go and just go with the flow or use the Force. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Indra, you're the last to let go.
Oh, bye then. Yeah, no, I really like that, what you're suggesting, and it reminds me that two things. One is that we should really be aware that we're living, and have always been living all of our lives, in an industry of storytelling. Let's not forget that people are being paid all the time to write the stories that will harness us. So whether it's government level, or whether it's the advertising agencies, or whether, this is a storytelling industry and we're in it, right? So therefore, and the second thing that I felt was that we should become capable of managing our stories, which is kind of what you're describing a little bit. And often when I am with a client in psychotherapy, I encourage them to think about themselves not as a person looking for an identity, but as a soap opera, right? You are a soap opera because you yourself have many different characters that you're playing through all the time. And if you can name your own soap opera and understand your multiple personalities in relationship to each other and how they tell a story about yourself, that actually makes people infinitely stronger. Because they're not then at the mercy of this idea that there's got to be the one story or the one identity that they've got to stick to, which will give them all the answers. But even as I'm saying that, and I think that becoming capable of that is the capacity of our time. We should be able to master our own minds and be able to understand the environment of stories we're in. Even as I'm saying that, right now, I personally, I don't know how you feel about this, in the midst of something quite extraordinary. We're in an age where really, really challenging things are happening in our public space. And I just want to leave with the one thing that I'm grappling with right now, which is the power of the story of the coronavirus, right? The power of the story of the coronavirus. What is it exactly? Because on the one hand, it's dominating all of our news headlines in a really quite unbelievable way. Why is it dominating in that way, given it's only this many deaths? And so, it's in reality, it's not such a big thing, but it's still doing this. But the impact of it, which is what we call soft power, right? It's the power of storytelling, is causing markets to shut down, aviation industries to be seriously threatened. We are in this moment suddenly dropping our carbon levels in ways we could never have achieved in any other way, right? What is going on? It's like, is this Greta and her mind control? It's like we're getting outcomes out of things that we never imagined would achieve these outcomes. And suddenly the power of this moment is suddenly appearing, and I'm thinking, I want to go with that. I want to go with that. I don't know what it is even, but I'm going with the idea that we could achieve our ends in ways we never imagined possible.
I can see Catherine's got something to say on that.
I did a big study on looking at contagion on the internet, and when there was a disease the spike is phenomenal of how much people pay attention, because it's this instant threat of which we're helpless to. And I completely echo you. If we could encapsulate that feeling and see, rather than it disease, as sort of global warming, the attention we would pay to keep ourselves safe is amazing.
And by very strange coincidence, because with the rapid transition thing, we do like a story a week, and the story we're working on this week for either next week or the week after is exactly looking at responses to pandemics and health scares and seeing what lessons can be codified from that for mobilizing to achieve rapid change. But I feel that we've had, I wasn't quite sure where the conversation was going to go today. It's gone from deep mythology to, understanding how our own needs are taken and written into stories, and how the whole idea of becoming more aware about how other people write us into stories, how sometimes unwittingly we write ourselves into stories, that just becoming aware of this feels a little bit like one of Chomsky's notions about tools for intellectual self-defense. Now that's part one. Part two, of course, is coming up with the better stories, the stories about how we make the transition. And I think that's kind of back over to you, but we've seen the kind of the creativity. I feel, if not the heat in the room, I feel the heat of creativity and thought power about how we can tell a better human story about how we live and thrive in the world. And for that, I thank you ever so much for listening. And I invite you to thank our panel as we come to the end of this session. Thank you so much.